Hello, welcome back everybody. PayPal and Patreon links are down below if anybody wants to support me. Only do so if you actually can. This is primarily going to be podcast type audio, not that many shifting visuals, so go ahead and do something else while listening if you want. Going over this concept again, why is everything seeming, at least to anyone born post World War II, like it's starting to fall apart? Why is life starting to get more and more expensive? Not just an illusion of inflation, but even accounting for inflation. Why is everything starting to go backwards? Starting to percentage-wise take up more and more of your income, more and more of your time. That is because what I refer to as the prosperity age is basically over, or the time frame from the 50s up until the approach to the first global oil production peak started in the mid 2000s or so. You see, foundationally, the function of our world revolves around three things. You have things, you have energy, and you have time. The sun comes and beats down on all the plant life on the earth, and the plants are then consumed, at least some of them by us, others by animals that we then consume. The atmosphere is warmed by the sun to different extents in different areas, creating differences in air density and pressure differentials, making the air start to move, creating wind. Water is evaporated in lower places and falls in higher places and thus starts flowing down in the form of rivers, blah, 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 blah. All of that I just mentioned is current energy, energy of the present. So back in the day, things were pretty restrictive for the longest time. We spent our days, literally our entire days, going out, planting and harvesting edible plants, herding and grazing edible livestock, chopping down bigger plants to burn for heat, arduously making clothing, constructing homes, grinding tools, sharpening things by hand, human labor, locked into the use of current energy. The amount of time spent was large, the amount of things producible was low, and the energy we put into acquiring food was pretty close to the amount of energy we got out of it. However, eventually we broke this cycle. Fossil hydrocarbons. You see, over the course of time, all that sunlight falling down onto all those plants is not and was not always consumed by animals, or did not simply fall to the forest floor and then decay. Many times it fell to the forest or swamp floor, or in terms of phytoplankton and algae, down to the ocean floor in mass die-off events and was then buried by sedimentation. And then more was, and then more was, constantly packed and condensed. So many countless moments of prior or past present energy were captured and buried, and even better, condensed as they were buried into even more energy dense forms. And this immense, on demand, unimaginable abundance of stored energy lifted the prior burdens off of humanity, lifted the prior constraints. We started burning coal, which would boil water into steam, and the steam would expand and drive pistons, and the steam driving these pistons would do the work of hundreds of men. Or in terms of moving things, as we invented trains, it can move the same amount of weight as thousands of horses, and going at 10, 20 times the speed of horses. Steamships removed the burden of reliance on the wind. They could move when you wanted them to, and keep moving as long as you wanted them to, and move faster and carry more weight. Although in terms of transportation, coal ultimately does have its limits, as it does not have the volumetric energy density of liquid fuel, which we quickly then adopted as well, as we moved into petroleum. Ages and ages of all the sunlight that fell upon the plant life of the earth condensed down now into this exceptionally energy-dense liquid, and at the start, in reservoirs very near to the surface, in many cases seeping up from the ground, where all we really had to do was punch a few holes. Liquid fuel is perfectly compact, easily transportable, and directly combustible. That's the key. You don't need steam as a middleman. You directly combust or explode the liquid fuel in the cylinders, in the piston chambers of an engine. which is part of what allowed for the existence of smaller, lighter vehicles, what allowed for the development of flight. All this absurd, on-demand, high-yield energy, where once our source of energy, which was our food, was little more than a 1-for-1, maybe 2-for-1 yield. Now our energy sources had yields for us in the hundreds and hundreds to one. This allowed the rise of the modern world and its various luxuries that you know. We were able to remove the manual burden from ourselves and put it onto machines. Since we had all this abundant excess energy to power these machines, this allowed us in every way to make many more things in the same amount of time, actually even less time, which meant there was much more for many more people now, also allowing us obviously to move so much more across such greater distances in such an enormously condensed amount of time. This obscenely dense and abundant energy allowed for the now existence of massive behemoth mining equipment, which allows us to acquisition so much more material in such a short amount of time. Material and elements that we never before really had enough to do things with, or at least the kind of things we can now, like have power grids, have electricity. Let's not even get started on how many things the existence of electricity provides. And so off we went into modern civilization, and after the two great disruptions, mass death events, in the first half of the 20th century, we entered what I was referring to as the prosperity age, or the truly obscene abundance age, from the 50s up until we started curving onto the first oil production peak around the mid-2000s. And now we seem to have run into a stall of sorts, or in some aspects a bit of a downward trend. Now, why is that? Well, back to that whole energy yield ratio thing. We were getting this oil from, as I previously described, really near to the surface reservoirs under extremely high pressure, with oil even seeping to the surface in some cases. Well, with the exception of the Persian Gulf reservoirs, we've used up a fair bit of that. And so as we've used that up over the last couple decades in particular, we've rapidly had to fill those demand gaps with new sources. Those new sources initially just being deeper, less pressurized reservoirs, being farther and farther deeper offshore reservoirs out in the ocean, which requires a lot more infrastructural setup, hyper-pressurized pumping of water to fracture rocks in which petroleum is trapped in much smaller pockets, boiling huge enormous amounts of steam to pump down wells in places like the tar sands in Canada to steam lift the oil out from the sand itself into an actual pressurized flow to the surface. All these things, obviously, as you could probably infer from the additional description of their acquisition, do not have magnificently excessive energy yields in the hundreds to one. Most of them are down more between 10 and 40 to 1, which is still comparatively, compared back to when it was just us and our food, that is by all means still enormously excessive. However, it is not as mind-numbingly excessive as what we were dealing with for most of the 20th century with stuff like, 200 to 1 yield. So we're gradually going into the situation where more and more of the energy that we're getting has to go back into getting that energy because of the various increasing difficulties discussed. And that is increasingly producing the effect of less net energy available, and also because of all the extra stuff that has to be done to get it. Said energy, said fuel is growing more and more expensive. And even over on the material side, we have hit a similar downward trend or a similar stall as for the most part up through the 20th century until you get into the later couple decades. We were mining ore bodies that had wondrous concentrations, sometimes as high as 15% of the metal that we were after. However, we have dug most of those up, and that dug up metal is now locked into its usage. And so as we expand out looking for more, we are having to now rely on lesser ore bodies with much less concentrations. Like, for example, copper, we're now having to rely on around 1% copper, which obviously means less and less for the same amount of energy and time, which means more mining itself has to be done to get the same amount, which means more equipment and more resources expended to do it, which lessens the excess amount available and gradually increases the price. And so, there you have it. Such is the setup that we've come into now, having passed the first oil production peak and heading towards the second and possibly final one sometime later this decade or so. Many people are trying to say that everything will be fine. Wind and solar will make everything cheap and awesome again. However, that's not true. Wind and solar are present energy and intermittently dependent energy. They're not on-demand energy. They're not controllable energy. They're not really dense energy. They are sparse, present energy. And the sheer amount of infrastructure and material to actually rely upon them is simply not comparable to, say, fossil fuel power plants, where you build that one power plant and that power plant generates a gigawatt or two versus the same amount of material used to make, in a best case scenario, a few dozen wind turbines, which will give you something like 50 megawatts, assuming that the wind is blowing across all of them at once. And so to even guarantee, or hopefully guarantee, that you get the same amount of energy out of wind and solar, you have to build so much more and use so much more material, energy, and time to have literally multiple excesses of your total possible grid demand, because not all of that stuff is ever going to be able to be generating at the same time. If you want to see workings in the math of how renewables, at least in wind and solar's case, and electric vehicles and everything aren't going to work out, have a video specifically detailing that math with various resource constraints. I'll have that in a link in the corner if you want to click back on the tab now. All these limits we're now running into also tie into the fact that economic growth is not going to continue probably past the 2030s, which I also did a specific video on that the link in the corner will now switch over to if you want to watch that one. But otherwise, that is it for this. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. Go watch some of my other stuff. I have too many episodes about all kinds of things. Go subscribe to my cat, please. We really need to get her up to 1,000 subs before the monetization deadline runs out, which is in a few days probably. PayPal and Patreon are there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. But no matter what happens to me, may God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.